Okay, I think we can start now. People will trickle in as they come. Good evening, everyone. My name is Pindile, and I'm excited to be one of your hosts. I'll be joined by Megan, and she'll introduce herself soon. But yes, thank you so much all for coming to attend this webinar. We're very excited to have our panelists on board, and we'll introduce them in a few moments. But I just wanted to say thank you all for coming. We're very excited to have you, and we think this is a very important discussion. We're very honored to have both of the profs here to share experience from the other side, being on an ethics committee and reviewing some of the protocols that we as young researchers submit. And so I think it'll be exciting to get some insight and some useful tips so that we can learn how to start this research journey ethically, hence the title of our webinar, to research with integrity. And I think that's something we should all strive towards. So hopefully this is the beginning of that, and that this will fuel further discussions and spark a few more questions that we can ask at the end of the webinar, but also on other platforms. So yeah, we will go on to the next slide. So the program today, I've just welcomed you all. Megan will cover some housekeeping, and then we'll introduce our two panelists. After that, we will ask the panelists a few questions, and then at the end, we will open the floor for any additional questions, and then we'll be closing off the webinar with some final remarks, things to remember, and just to a vote of thanks to everyone who's contributed to making this webinar such a success. So I'll now be handing over to Megan.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for attending, and thank you to our speakers. Just some housekeeping rules. Please keep the camera on if possible to maximize engagement. Could we ask everyone to keep their audio mute? Ask questions in the chat to indicate whether this is a follow-up or a new question as well. Please note that questions will be filtered by our facilitating committee and that members will be asked at the end once the floor is open. And please feel free to use the react function to engage with our speakers. We'll have a wonderful evening, and thank you again.
Okay, thanks, Megan. I will be introducing our first panelist, Professor Blockman. Prof was one of my pharmacology lecturers at UCT, which is not part of his amazing resume, but that is something exciting that he's always been very passionate about, being a part of the academic teaching of young medical students. But I'll just go through his brief CV so we can learn a little bit more about him and hopefully see why we've invited him and why we're so honored to have him here. So Professor Blockman is a professor in the Department of Internal Medicine and a senior consultant in the Division of Clinical Pharmacology at Groote and UCT. He exemplifies a strong culture of evidence-based medical practice, exemplified by his involvement in teaching, as I already said, and application of the evidence-based ethos. He has been involved since 1995 with the Essential Drugs Program of South Africa, becoming chairman in 2008 and co-chair in 2025. He is a member of the university's medical and bioethics program, and he is chair of the Health Sciences Human Research and Ethics Committee, as well as chair of various data safety monitoring committees. He is chair of the University of Cape Town's Senate Ethics and Research Committee, which plays an oversight role over all the research ethics committees of the university. He's also recognized as an expert on international, national, and provincial drug policy and serves on SAMTRA. As chairperson of the Pharmacovigilance Expert Committee and member of the Clinical Expert Committee. He serves as an international consultant for the WHO and is executive member of the provincial government of the Western Cape's Pharmacy and Therapeutics Advisory Committee and is chair of the Groote Hospital's PTC. He's also a well-respected lecturer and was awarded the Distinguished Teachers Award from the University of Cape Town. So welcome, Prof. We're excited to have you and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much for the wonderful introduction. Hello, everybody.
Moving on to our second panelist, I've had the honor of being in Professor Renée Blaauw's lectures as well, and also serving as a colleague. Professor Renée Blaauw is a professor in therapeutic nutrition at the Division of Human Nutrition, Stellenbosch University, South Africa. She is a registered dietitian with the Health Professions Council of South Africa, a past chairperson of the Professional Board for Dietetics in South Africa, as well as a past president of SASPN. Prof is both an honorary member of both SASPN and ADSA. Currently, Professor Blaauw is serving as the President-elect and Scientific Secretary of SASPN. Her main research interests include nutrition support of critically ill patients, micronutrients, and hospital malnutrition. To this effect, she is a member of the GLIM, which is the Global Leadership Initiative on Malnutrition, working group, and her endeavors to contribute to the evidence base regarding adult hospital nutrition or malnutrition in South Africa. At the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences at Stellenbosch University, she has served in the Health Research Ethics Committee for 6 years. She has then chaired the Undergraduate Research Ethics Committee for an additional 6 years. She is an NRF-rated researcher and has supported 10 PhD and 40 master's students to successful graduation. Welcome to both of our panelists. We're excited to get the ball rolling.
Thank you, Megan. Good evening to everybody. Thanks for being here.
Okay, thank you. So we'll begin with the question and answer session. I'll ask the first question and Megan and I will be alternating. So our first question is for Prof. Blockman, and that is, who should researchers apply to for ethics approval? What is the process and how can medical trainees determine which projects require approval, especially in cases that fall into gray areas?
Okay, so you asked me to make some slides. Would you like me to share it or just speak? I'm very comfortable, as you know, not to use slides and just to speak. It's up to you.
We're very happy for you to also just speak, Prof, but if you do have slides, we wouldn't want those to go to waste, but
So
whatever's
I've rolled
comfortable.
slides over. So I've got, so I was asked a whole lot of questions. So I've kind of have slides for each of the answers. Would you like me to try and go through that, or would you like me
Yes.
just to answer?
Maybe you can use the slides, Prof. Yeah,
Okay, so you have
we'll.
to bear with me because they may not be in the order you've asked the questions.
Oh, okay.
I'm extremely old, so you should be able to see that. Is that right?
Yes.
Good, and I'll put that in that mode. Okay, so let me just see where we are. Just to see, because you wanted to know. Good. Okay, so maybe I should start at the beginning. How's that? And then you can just kill me when you want to. Okay, so
Okay.
so so basically, here's some of the history, and our history is around a checkered past of experimentation with humans, where autonomy is lost and participants have had no ability to provide fully informed consent. And it's good to understand the history because as we move forward, we've got to work out what went wrong going backwards. And so you'll know about the Nazi experiments. There was a whole lot of the Nazi experiments, all of them done without informed consent and would never be upheld, despite the fact people think that we should use some of the data from these experiments. Bad ethics is bad science and bad science is bad ethics. And that resulted in Nuremberg Code after the Nuremberg trials, where this was the first code of research ethics in terms of making sure that participation was voluntary. And it's quite hard in our environment for true voluntarism, especially in healthcare research, because of the lack of access to healthcare. And then the Tuskegee syphilis study, where participants were continued to be followed up when after penicillin was founded and weren't given the cure to see what actually happens when you don't manage syphilis. And history repeated itself only a couple of years ago. And this is the Arkansas gel ivermectin experiment where patients were given ivermectin without their consent. So despite the fact that we are evolving and understanding where we come from, there's still atrocities which are occurring today. And here's some of the codes that we subscribe to, and codes that you should have heard about is the Declaration of Helsinki, the Belmont Report, and the SIOMs. These are very, very important codes, as well as the National Health Research Ethics Council guidelines for health research within our country. And the bottom line is that the Declaration of Helsinki spoke about the high ethical standards to promote and ensure respect for all human subjects to protect their health and rights. And this is around respect and the agency of participants. So I just tried to move this a little bit. I have done that successfully. And so importantly that all health-related research, and it's very broad, needs to be reviewed by a Human Research Ethics Committee. And you may say that we can guess what shouldn't be reviewed. That would be inappropriate. Everything must be put in front of a Human Research Ethics Committee, and a decision can then be made to waive or not to waive, or to approve or not to approve. And no research can occur until the Ethics Committee has granted this type of approval. And in our environment, we give approval for 1 year, and we do not give retrospective ethics approval. And so if you've done research without ethics approval, we will not grant ethics approval in the retrospective. That is very unfortunate, and often when it occurs in undergraduate and postgraduate research, that leads to trauma for everybody. The committee is independent. Its objective is to protect participants. And just what do we look at? Scientific quality, because bad science is bad ethics. We also look at competency to make 100% sure that the person doing the study is competent, or has at least a competent colleague to help facilitate the study. And we look to try and mitigate risks as best as possible. But you'll know that some of the research, and especially intervention research, may in fact cause risk. What is looked at is appropriate informed consent, adequate insurance if it's required, and that's no-fault insurance, where the ex gratia payment is provided. And we look at the methods of recruitment, which is really important for us, is where are people being recruited for, how and why, and any payment which may be made in terms of an undue inducement. And we also look at the payments to the investigator site, because people may be paid a fortune to recruit participants, and that may erode informed consent and voluntarism. So what does our committee look like? Well, it sits underneath the National Health Research Ethics Council. We are accredited to be able to provide human research ethics approval for not only undergraduate, postgraduate, and academic research and investigator-initiated research, but research that is linked to the FDA, the EMA, and federally funded research as well. We sit under the UCT Senate Research Ethics Committee, which is I chair as well. And then you'll see that there's Human Research Ethics Committee, Animal Ethics, we mustn't forget. And importantly, a lot of colleagues forget, is the Biosafety Committee. And as you know, as we look more at biological medicines, these require a biosafety review to make sure that we're not going to cause problems within the community. And so when is human research ethics review required? Any research involving human participants requires a review, and involving obviously human biological materials for both living and deceased individuals. And despite the fact it's one always thinks about it being living, we look to protect, if necessary, the deceased individual for the risk of stigmatization. So when research may be waived by the Human Research Ethics Committee, well, maybe if the information is in the public domain and there's no reasonable expectation of privacy, when information is legally accessible to the public and appropriately protected by law, and creative works, art or music. But importantly, this must still receive a waiver, so it must be put in front of the Ethics Committee to decide if this requires approval, review, or a waiver of that, which means that if I go back to the beginning, everything needs review until the Human Research Ethics Committee says it's not required. And in our faculty, there's a departmental research committee that looks at the scientific conduct of the research, and if it's opportunity not to be futile, and whether the investigators are competent and will be able to complete the study. Then you need to apply and do that appropriately. And then the PI submits the protocol to us for review. And so before you apply, some tips. One needs to develop a scientifically and ethically sound protocol in consultation with your supervisor. And importantly, if you have I like it if somebody says to me, you're going to knape by this. I'm happy with that because it means you thought about the ethics, and we can try and navigate the space if there's social value. Use our website. It's really important. We've got a whole lot of SOPs and tips in terms of the application. And we also have various forms in terms of application. And then our SOPs, which gives you some understanding about how to apply and what to put into our application forms. And then please consult us if there's any additional guidance, and also obviously the office. So that's a short potpourri into what it looks like, what you must do in terms of applying, and maybe some of the history. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof, for such a great presentation. That's very, very helpful. I think I'm glad we're recording this because people can also take down the information you shared at the end on how to actually practically submit that application. I'll be handing over to Megan.
Thank you very much, Prof. Blockman. That was quite an extensive answer and great to hear the history as well. We'll be handing our first question over to Prof. Blaauw. What are the key differences that young researchers should be aware of between local and international research ethics requirements? And to what extent should international collaborators adapt to local ethical standards versus maintaining their own frameworks?
Thank you, Megan. And I think I'm going to start with not what are the differences, but actually what are the similarities. Because Prof. Blockman have actually already spoken about it. The International Declaration of Helsinki applies wherever globally you perform and you conduct research. And that ultimately is probably the most important document that we should all follow. So that will be your number one standard. It doesn't matter who you are, where you're doing your research, that's number one. But then there are country-specific guidelines as well, and he's already alluded to those. We've got South African GCP Good Clinical Practice Guidelines. We've got Medical Research Council guidelines. We've got National Department of Health Ethics in Health Research guidelines. So there are very specific country-specific guidelines that we also have to adhere to. So it's a long list of documents that you have to consider whenever you put forward an application to your local ethics committee, which in our case obviously will be here in South Africa. So what is important is that your international collaborator cannot enforce anything on you. The local guidelines always trumps, whatever they feel, as long as we adhere to the Declaration of Helsinki. And the Declaration of Helsinki speaks to the most important components like obtaining informed consent and having a proper protocol and ensuring that all your researchers are adequately qualified, that you use proper science and scientific rigor, all the things that Prof. Blockman has already alluded to. So those are sort of non-negotiable. But then, as I've said, we've got specific guidelines locally in terms of what we should look out for. So if you conduct a study that is a collaborative study, let's say you've got an international partner, there's an overarching protocol that was written, and then they have various sites across the world where that study needs to be conducted. So the PI, the overarching PI in whichever country that might be, will get the ethics approval in that country. But then if you conduct your research in South Africa, you still need to submit it to your local ethics committee. You submit what we call a reciprocal ethics application, which means in essence, the science and the rigor has already been evaluated by the overarching ethics committee. And in that case, the local ethics committee will specifically focus on what are the implications here? How does it affect our patients? Is it doable? Is it practical, etc.? So you still need those various layers of approval. And maybe while I'm talking about these layers of approval, also remember, once you've received your ethics application and your approval letter, you still need to get further approvals. For instance, if you want to do it in a hospital, or if you want to work at a specific clinic, you need Department of Health, or let's say City of Cape Town, or whatever the case might be. You need additional approvals. Or if you go into schools, you need Department of Education approval. So there's a long list of potential approvals that you need to go through. So please remember that you build adequate time for ethics as well as all the approvals into your planning phase of your research. And each of these steps, even though it is highly frustrating as the researcher because you want to get going, But each of these steps are there to protect the participant, to make sure that we do not unduly do anything that will harm them, that will cause them discomfort, etc. So those are very important components. If you want to conduct a clinical trial, then I've already mentioned the South African GCP Good Clinical Practice Guidelines. Then each and every one of the researchers, everybody that's involved, everybody that will touch anything that has to do with the patient or the data from the participant, you all need GCP training. So the GCP training, Good Clinical Practice training, is done, and you have to renew your training every 4 to 5 years. And every single one of the participants, of the research group, needs a GCP certificate when you apply. So again, something to think of in front of us before you submit your application, because that's another component that might potentially take a little bit of time. So a lot of things to consider. I would think that if you a young researcher and you start off, you most likely will probably do your own thing. It will probably be more of a local research study and not starting off by being collaborators on an international study. So then, you can decide which of the ethics committee in South Africa you want to apply for. If it is research for a degree purpose, then obviously you have to apply to the university where you will obtain your degree. They need to provide the primary ethics approval. But let's say you're at Stellenbosch, you get your approval from us, but you also have data collection that will happen at UCT. You have to still submit your protocol for reciprocal approval at the UCT site or in Joburg or wherever the case might be. So there are different layers of approvals. And as I've said, each and every one of those sites look at things slightly differently, but ultimately to protect the participant. Thanks, Megan.
Thank you, Prof. Blaauw, and especially so for highlighting those dimensions and that it can be quite extensive in terms of considerations on what the primary investigator needs to consider. Thank you very much. We'll be handing over to Pindile.
Thank you, Prof. Blaauw. That was very, very helpful. And I think, thank you for also acknowledging that this must be pre-planned into some of the time and resource considerations when we look at gaining approval. The next question will be for Prof. Blockman, and that'll be, what are the most common mistakes that young researchers make when applying for ethics approval, and how can they anticipate these issues to avoid delays or rejections by research ethics committees?
So I'll use the miracle again of slides. Can you see that? How's that looking? Let me move this off. Okay, so what I did was I looked at maybe the top 10 reasons why approvals may be delayed, and I broke it up into 10 reasons, and I'll say a few words on each of those going forward. And please don't worry, I can sell you these slides afterwards. So the first one, I'm going to work backwards, is insufficient information upon which to determine risk benefit. And as I move forward, I'm actually going to go from 10 to 1, but I'm just telling you what we're looking at. And the benefit is greater than the risk is not made explicit, and so we don't know what the benefit is. The design is inadequate, informed consent problems, privacy and confidentiality issues not addressed, selection of participants is not equitable or described, research and clinical care is difficult to distinguish, so we don't know which is which. It's an unethical study. Administrative details not addressed appropriately, and the way it's been responded to. So if I look at the first one, the response format, and people must be diligent in terms of responding to us. And I remind you that we can't get into the heads of the investigators. So if it's not written down, it's really hard to know. And despite the fact you've plowed hours into developing the protocol, you still need to explain to us simply what you're doing. And so often people say, well, it's in the application, you should have read it. One doesn't actually itemize what we've asked. And that's very similar to as if you answer a journal, is to answer us that in that specific format. And we don't know what the changes are. There's no track change, it's not highlighted, so you can't see the difference in the format. There's also administrative details which we are required to take care of. We like the principal investigator to be a staff member in our faculty, so we've got kind of accountability. We don't always know the persons with subject contact. We don't know persons from other institutions and their qualifications. The funding resources are left out, and if there's any review by any research ethics committee. And that's quite important. We've had instances where an ethics committee in the country has in fact disallowed a study and rejected a study, and we've approved it. And down the line, there's been issues. And not to say that one is right and one is wrong, but it would have been great if one knew that there was a negative outcome, because one could have entertained what those issues were. What the visits for research purposes are beyond what is usual for clinical care. We're not comfortable too much in divided compensation, which says we're going to remunerate you if you do this and you come to the last visit, and we're going to give you the biggest tranche at the last visit. That's deemed to be inducement or potentially coercive, and any inducement to participate would be deemed to be problematic in our environment. Also, lay summaries. I remind you that not everybody on ethics committees are clinical, for example, and so may not understand what the science is, and so lay summary is really helpful. Often it's not signed, we don't know who's applying, the location of the study is left out, the contact informations, and we don't know if, we don't like, we need to understand, I apologize, if people at the institutions, Grootskel or other institutions as well as university are in fact participants. And if that's the case, we really need to think very clearly about their vulnerabilities. The other issue is unethical study. It's really rare. We probably reject 2 or 3 studies a year, and we receive about 1,100 studies. So it's unusual for it to be totally unethical. And generally, some of the issues are that standard of care is often withheld because we're deemed to be a third world country, and it's okay to not to provide proper standard of care. And that's just one of the reasons. Often the research in clinical care is difficult to distinguish, and that's really important, is that one, it's is problematic for the participant because they not clear about that this is research, this aspect is research, and this aspect is in fact care, and they may just volunteer thinking they're getting clinical care. And so we need to understand the two, because it may change the way informed consent is performed. And we may in fact remove the person who's looking after the patient at that time, who because they're so entrenched in the clinical care that they are not allowed to take informed consent, because they're already in a strong relationship. The other issues is around screening. A lot of people just screen with one, also not getting ethics approval, because it's expedient to screen, and we need to understand what screening looks like, because there are consent issues around screening as well. The issues around participants not being selected equitable, or it's not even described where they're being selected from. There's exclusion of the state sector, exclusion of certain marginalized populations, because it's easy and expedient. You target disadvantaged or vulnerable because they need access to care, and they may just put up their hand and volunteer. You exclude non-English speakers, and you include minors without any justification within the study. And we're very happy to have minors. We have a need, they're under research, but we need to understand why they're being included and why they may be included up front. Privacy and confidentiality issues are not well addressed in recruitment. You hand out leaflets for a potential syphilis or HIV study within a shopping center, for example, and so it deemed to be problematic. Or you recruit people from the line in a healthcare environment. That's very problematic. One needs to understand understand these measures in the protocol and in the informed consent document. It can't just be in the protocol. They have to be mirrored in the informed consent document. And there's issues on confidentiality. We're not sure about who holds on to the data, what's going to happen to the data, and one needs to be explicit about that. Importantly, informed consent issues, the reading level is too high, and I've got some conversation around that and legalistic. There's a scale called the Flesch-Kincaid scale, which is what we use. We run it through the Flesch-Kincaid scale to see if it's grade 6 to grade 8. The risk of simple innocuous tests not included when they should be. They say, who's your doctor in the consent document? It's already a problem because there's already an established relationship and people may be scared not to say yes. And one must understand the implications of a test rather than stating liver functions. You must say why. And the whole idea of informed consent is for people to say no, not to say yes. For me, if you can say no, then that's a very good informed consent process and people have maintained their autonomy. Often the study design is inadequate, poor science is poor ethics. It's really important, and Professor Blaauw suggested that early on. We don't know, the science is not clear, it's not adequate or appropriate for what you are looking for, the sample size is not justified, and one doesn't specify outcomes and comparisons appropriately, and nobody knows what's going to happen with the data and what the analysis will look like. And these are critical for us to make a risk-benefit decision on the study. And then the benefits and risks are not made explicit. And I remind you that the ethics committee's job is to try and get the best benefit and mitigate risk. And so one needs to know what that looks like for us to be able to make that decision. And there's nonsensical statements, benefits none, risks some, conclusions benefit outweigh the risks. It's really problematic. And opinions are stated but not explicitly supported. So people come up with a thought process that the benefits are high or there's no really risk, but they don't actually justify why they've said that. And then insufficient information upon which to determine risk benefit. And so that's really important. One has to really be clear in the protocol what you're doing, why you're doing it, what you're recruiting, who you're recruiting, what the risks look like, what we may think may happen, because that enables us to make a good risk-benefit decision. And if any of these aren't in the actual protocol, it's extremely hard for an approval to occur. So what happens, we write you a letter, then you have to write something back, we have to review it, hopefully not have to write you a letter, another letter, but if again it's not explained, we have to write another letter, and that really just delays the process and stops you doing your research timelessly. May I give you some do's and don'ts, Pindi?
Yes, that's perfect, Prof.
So the do's and don'ts, if it's not written down, we won't know about it. So you've got to actually write it down. All protocol issues need to be in the protocol. We often find aspects in the informed consent are never in the protocol. You've got to talk about the regulations, the Helsinki Declaration, for example. You must tell us what is part of the research and what is not. You must be explicit about that. Don't try and bypass the process. You send it directly to myself or to the chair. Things will get lost and delayed because I already told you I'm old, and so the admin will be a disaster. You must define the inclusion and exclusion criteria because that's about risk and risk benefit. Be clear when a study is not testing a treatment, not testing a treatment efficacy. This is very common, cut and paste errors. You'll suddenly be reading something on high blood pressure and suddenly there'll be something on ischemic heart disease or some other condition because people have cut and paste because obviously that helps them with the process. We must understand the remuneration and who will be paid, for example, the investigator. And if a research lab is used, what could the delays be in terms of the study and especially for safety results to be provided back to the investigators. Avoid typographical errors, very problematic because that shows a bit sloppiness. Be explicit about a drug is exempt from, SAMTRA, I don't know why I wrote MCC, that's really old. And consistency throughout the application. Sometimes the application changes, and I think because different people write the application, one needs to be consistent. Also, people say that something was approved before, and so you should approve it now. And I remind you that ethics change, discourse changes, and so what may have been approved previously may not be approved now. And avoid asking for a speedy review, because whose protocol should be delayed and who should you be doing above that person. When pregnancy is an exclusion, state how and when it's tested. One must be very specific about pregnancy. We in fact trying to include more and more pregnant women in studies so we get the data. Don't forget to address the controls when counting participants for recruitment and for the informed consent forms. And that's my do's and don'ts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. That's great. That's such a great filter through which we can start the process and then review that we've actually adhered to that at the end. And we'll definitely be haggling you for a free look at these slides at the end. Thank you
With
so
great
much.
pleasure.
Thanks, Prof.
Thank you, Prof. Pendile. We'll hand over to Prof. Blaauw. How can researchers, especially trainees, raise concerns about unethical practices that they witness, such as questionable study designs, data interpretation, or authorship, and what this while navigating power hierarchies and protecting their careers?
Thanks, Megan. I just want to add something to the previous question before I answer this one. A potential mistake is not allowing enough time. And Prof Blockman mentioned it a few times, but we find so many times, especially if it's for degree purposes, that people wait until they realize, oh my goodness, I'm going to miss the graduation deadline. Now they want to squeeze it through ethics. It just doesn't work like this. So as Prof has mentioned, you will get it back. There will be some comments for you to address in a rebuttal document. It goes back to ethics. And then it's all the other processes. So please allow enough time for this whole process. Otherwise, you get stressed up and you stress everybody in the process. It's just not worth it. So to come to your question about concerns with unethical practices, a very difficult one. And I guess the fact that you asked this question is there must have been something that somebody picked up or that they were part of. I would say number one is do your homework very well. So if you think that somebody else is conducting research and you're not comfortable with the study design, or you're not comfortable with the way in which they approach their participants or anything like that, it's great. And it's really good that you've picked it up. But before you maybe address them or approach them, maybe just take one step back and ask yourself, what is going on here? Because that research needs to have been approved by an ethics committee, which means the study design, the rigor, all of that should have been approved in the first place. So either these researchers are not adhering to their protocol, which is a cause for concern, or your interpretation of what should be done is differently. So just take your step back and try and see if you can trace that protocol. If it's, for instance, a clinical study, that protocol needs to be published and submitted to, let's say, for instance, clinicaltrials.gov, which is a clinical trials registry, and there are other registries as well. So you can always go back there and you can look at that protocol and see what was actually planned and approved, and then you can compare again whether you think that what they're doing is according, and it's above board. If you then feel very comfortable that you've really addressed everything and you are comfortable about your facts, you can obviously either speak to the colleague, or if you feel more comfortable, just try and address the higher ups. There's always another person down the line, either the HOD or the REC committee. There should be somebody else that you can address this concern of yours. I think the question that I also got from in between the lines was specifically when it comes to authorship. And I know that is a huge cause for concern, and many people feel uncomfortable when it comes to authorship, because there are many people that claim and that state that some people just add their names in order to chase publications, but they don't really add value to the whole process. So the International Committee for Medical Journals Editors, ICMJE, have very, very clear guidelines on authorship. And when you submit your manuscript to a publication, 9 out of 10 times, all of the authors need to sign this document, this ICMJE document. And that states that I hereby acknowledge that I've done 4 things. And those 4 things are that you've made a substantial contribution to the work throughout the process, throughout the journey, from protocol development through study implementation, through data analysis. So that whole process, number 1, that you've been involved in drafting the manuscript or critically reviewing. And critically reviewing a manuscript does not mean language and spelling errors. It means critically making a contribution to the content. Number 3 is that you've approved the final version, that you are comfortable that that version can be submitted for publication. And the 4th one, to me, probably even the most important one, is that you agree to be accountable for the content. And if you as author don't feel that you can tick all of those 4 boxes, then you should not be an author. If you've then played a role somewhere along the line in gathering data for the study, you can be acknowledged in the publication under the acknowledgement section, which is totally different from being part of the authorship section. So I think those guidelines are there, and it sort of guides the whole process. A last thing maybe just to mention here is that if you've done research as a student, being an undergraduate student or a postgraduate student, then you must remember that the intellectual property of that research remains the property of the institution where you did your research, whichever university that might be. And most universities have very clear guidelines that if the students do not publish the work within a certain period of time, that work can then be used by the study leader or the principal overarching study leader or primary investigator, and that person can then publish. Because remember, as study leaders, a lot of our time also goes into trying to help students through the process. So for instance, at Stellenbosch, that time period is 6 months. So after you've graduated, if you haven't started the process of getting your manuscript ready in 6 months, I'm allowed to take that work and to move forward with a publication. I can then approach you and say, okay, this is where we are. Would you like to be a co-author? But then you have to tick these 4 boxes that I've just mentioned. In many cases, the students say, oh, you know what, I've moved on. I'm not really interested. Go on. And then they will be acknowledged as in the acknowledgement section. So it is important that there are different rules. So it really depends on which hat you have on and where you come from when it comes to these co-authorship things. But there are ways and means of checking what should the research be all about and what was planned, and then you can assess whether it was actually conducted according to that. Thanks, Megan.
Thank you. That was quite comprehensive and some gold nuggets in between. Definitely things to consider for our future researchers and current researchers. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you, Prof. I think it's great to be equipped with those 4 things as well, just in terms of establishing whether we feel that we can be part of authorship as younger researchers. The next question will be directed to Prof. Blockman. It is, what strategies and best practices can ensure informed and voluntary consent in challenging contexts, such as low literacy, language barriers, urgent care settings, or situations where patients may feel obliged to participate because their doctor is also the researcher?
Brilliant, thank you. And I'll go back to the miracle slides. And I'm hoping you can see something. Can you see anything?
Yes.
You should see something soon if I can get it. Okay, so the question of vulnerability, does it matter? And for me, the issues around informed consent, respect for persons and agency is around vulnerability. And so just to remind you what vulnerable groups there are, these are susceptible to exploitation, unequal power relationships, dependencies, and erosion of voluntariness element of the consent process. Now, I will remind you that we all are made vulnerable in certain situations. So despite the fact I walk on the wards like the Godfather that we are as court consultants, and that we are vulnerable to people above us and vulnerable to more people. There's so many bosses and that, and so situational issues make people vulnerable. So everybody has an opportunity to be vulnerable in all these power dynamic relationships. So I remind you that our patient population, a lot of the participants that we look after, are absolutely vulnerable because of various aspects, socioeconomic, etc., and access to healthcare. And so here, some of the categories: patients, those in institutions, diminished capacity, economically disadvantaged, socially disadvantaged, minority groups, and refugees. These are all vulnerable people, and they require absolute protection. And part of it is review by ethics committees and making sure that the data and what you're doing is valuable and has social value and for this population, but also it must also speak to the consent. And I say it again, consent for me is, can you say no? So some of the core ethical principles is respect for persons, and that's where we speak about autonomy and informed consent. Then there's beneficence and maleficence, which we've spoken about, justice around equitable selection of participants, and we look at distributive justice, and then respect for communities, which is around benefit sharing and cultural sensitivities. So respect for persons is around their ability to self-determine and for them to be able to say, I don't like what you're offering me, so I don't want to partake. And the important thing from an ethics point of view is to protect these persons with these who are vulnerable with impaired or diminished autonomy. And they need to be protected against harm or abuse. So what are the informed consent challenges? Low literacy, language barriers, stigma, power imbalances that occur within our environment. And so what is informed consent? It ensures that individuals have the opportunity to decide whether they want to participate in research, or I remind you, continue to participate in the research. People often think that the informed consent process is a single event and then you never have to ask again. One has to remind ourselves that at every opportunity, you need to give the participant an opportunity to say, I've had enough and I'm leaving without any consequences. And that's the respect for persons. And it's not it's only one of the part of obviously making research ethical. There are all the other aspects we've spoken about as well. And so you can't just do informed consent in isolation. You've got to look at everything within the protocol and the process. And it's, as I said, it's a process of reasoned decision. It's not one episode. It's not a single episode. So there's disclosure of information. I'm just drinking my generic water. There's understanding, which is important, voluntary decision-making and voluntary agreement. It all has to be voluntary. And understanding often may mean that one has to then provide a comprehension so that participants are fully able to understand the risk benefits and then make an informed decision. And just to say that for high risk research, one will not allow informed consent to occur at the initial setting. It may take one or two conversations before that occur. And as I've suggested, sometimes the principal investigator, who's also the carer, will not be able to take informed consent. So what about research participants' understanding? There's many studies to show that research participants have variable and often limited understanding of study information, the nature of the research, and research procedures. There's a lot of data on here, and this is signed here to indicate you have no idea of what you signed up for. And that's really a worry. And I like that because that's sometimes exactly the truth. Sorry to have data rich. Here's a meta-analysis, again, looking at understanding over 3 decades and some of the voluntary nature of participation, freedom to withdraw at any time, the component of informed consent, which is occurring or not occurring in these participants. The reading level is high, and I've suggested the Flesch-Kincaid is what we use. And sometimes us on the committee don't actually understand what the informed consent document is suggesting. It's written in such legalistics. They're too long. and they've got longer over time because of the legal requirements. And so we often ask for a single page or page and a half lay summary up front so people can understand. And often they're incomplete. You leave out the important issues around risk. And this is what we are trying not to have in terms of the consent process. So how do we improve informed consent? More is not always better. In fact, more is terrible, and so less is better. The timing is really important. If people are stressed or ill, one must be very careful about getting people to provide informed consent. Technology can help. One can use technology to send the information well in advance. You can use technology to help turn it into lay language so one is able to then provide better information. And so some of the solutions, local languages are critical, and not local language which is translated from United States academic institutions is what we see in some of our translations, but truly local languages. Visuals, pictograms, translators appropriately placed to enable and to help people give informed consent, culturally appropriate consent, and that means that we as ethics committee need to understand that, and the investigators need to understand the community that they are taking consent from, and it's an ongoing process, not once off, so people can keep on saying yes or in fact say no at any time without recourse. So just to remind you, what makes research ethical is social or scientific value, scientific validity, fair subject, favorable writ, and yet informed consent as being a critical aspect, potential respect for the potentially enrolled participants and collaborative partnerships. These are all around respect for persons, which is wrapped up into the consent process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you for that reminder just about how consent needs to be continual, simple for everyone to understand, and also that we should be empowering people to be able to say no. Over to you, Megan.
Thank you very much. This next question piggybacks quite closely onto what Prof just answered. So Prof Blaauw, what special considerations and safeguards should researchers, especially trainees, keep in mind when conducting studies with vulnerable populations, such as prisoners, refugees, or terminally ill patients? Over to you.
Thanks, Megan. And yes, as you said, Prof. Blockman has actually already addressed this to explain the whole process and what vulnerable populations mean. So I think I'll keep it short to say that you should not choose anybody to participate in your research because they're convenient. There should be a scientific reason why you do your research on a specific group of people. So that should always be your goal. And as I say, you need to be able to find that in the literature and add your reference to say, I need to use a population in the ICU because that's a highly vulnerable population because I want to do X, Y, and Z, not just because they are there and they have nothing else to do, I'm going to use them for my research. So that scientific rationale is hugely important. And then when it comes to the informed consent process of your vulnerable group, there are a couple of things to remember, and that apart from whether they understand, it is a matter of whether they have the ability to talk to you. So I've just mentioned ICU cases, for instance. A lot of my research is being done there. So it is highly tricky to get approval because the patients are sedated. So you cannot get consent from your patients in 9 out of 10 cases. So there's a whole layer of approaches that you should follow. The next in line will be the legal guardian or the person that has the legal proxy to sign or to talk on behalf of that participant. Then you need to get consent from them. If something happens and you can't get hold of them, then there is a next layer, and that is normally an independent physician, not the doctor in charge of the ICU, an independent person that can judge whether this patient meets or participant meets the requirements of the study and whether they will benefit from being part of the study. So all of those layers, but also highly important is the moment that participant is able to consent. So if the patient is not sedated anymore, they're awake and they can actually understand what you're saying, you have to go back to them and ask them to consent. If they say yes, perfect, you can continue. If they say no, you have to make sure that you delete all of the information that you've already gathered. So a long process. Maybe just lastly, when you perform or conduct research on children, again, there's also a layered approach. The child needs to assent. So you still have to ask the child whether they are willing to be part of the study, whatever it might be. Explain it to them absolutely in the terms of what they can understand. And they can say yes or no. But then also the parent or the legal guardian needs to officially provide consent. So again, you've got a different layered approach in obtaining consent whenever it becomes a more vulnerable group. Thanks.
Thank you, Prof. Quite extensive legal and ethical considerations and necessary motivation that's required in protecting our patients and those of our potential patients as well, or excuse me, potential participants. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Blaauw. Just a great reminder that we shouldn't give up on making sure that we get the correct consent, that there's always somebody next that can act in the best interests of our participants. The next question for Prof. Blockman, which is a complete change in gear, but very relevant to the neo-culture that we're living in. With the rise of big data, digital health, and AI in research, what emerging ethical concerns, particularly around privacy and local relevance, should we be paying attention to? And how might ethics review processes in low to middle income countries adapt to keep pace with these new frontiers, such as AI, gene editing, and personalized medicine, while still promoting sustainable, locally beneficial research?
Thank you, but no thank you. So I use ChatGPT to determine this. So I've got some thoughts. I've actually got some thoughts on AI that I've put down in terms of responsible use. Despite the fact our university has looked critically at taking away the issues around plagiarism, around AI, etc. So we've had different processes at the moment. So let me share what I've put down. Sharing. I'll move this aside. You may see something soon. It's all a bit slow. Okay. Okay, so I've kind of put some recommendations for research with responsible use of generative AI in research, and just some recommendations for researchers. And I've used the recent WHO 2024 document and the recent European Commission 2025 document. And I've highlighted that because it's worthwhile looking at as we navigate the space of AI. So just to say that one has to remain ultimately responsible for scientific output, the researcher. You can't say that was due to AI, and so it's all is forgiven. And so if you have content which is generated by or with generative AI, you still have to take full responsibility and be accountable for that output. One has to understand the bias and hallucinations in inaccuracies, which are the limitations of the use of AI, and you need to reflect on that in the work that you are doing in an honest manner, which means that you need to understand the generative tool that you're using, if you are using that to the best degree possible. Otherwise, you won't be able to do that. And I remind you, there's quite a lot of hallucinations. It makes up references as well. And the system can't be an author or co-author. So as Professor Blaauw suggested, authorship implies agency and responsibility. So that lies with the human researcher. So it gets down to, you have to take responsibility for that. You have to also use it in a transparent manner, and you have to then report what was used from an AI point of view and how did that contribute to the research. You have to provide appropriate reference to that. You need to look at the random nature of generative AI and the ability that it produces outputs from the same input. So you can input and it will give you a certain output. You can ask the same question and it may give you a different output as well, which may be very problematic in the research space, because what is the truth? And then whatever the limitations of AI, you need to disclose as well in your research. You must look at the biasness and what did you do to mitigate those risks. So you can see inherently, again, there's a huge accountability and responsibility on the investigator when they are looking at the use of AI. The issues are important about privacy and confidentiality and intellectual property rights, because once you've shared data on an AI tool, and especially if it's open access, then potentially you've actually shared sensitive information onto that platform, which can then be used by absolutely anybody. And so doing that, one must be very, very careful. One must understand what the governance is around that AI tool and where that information may go and where it may be stored, because these have huge ethical and legal implications, because you may be putting up data which is identifiable into generative AI space, and that's now open. It ends up being open access and freely available. And so you have to check assurances that data will not be reused, and there won't be an ability to re-identify the data that you've uploaded. And importantly, you've got to be very careful in providing personal data into these tools unless a participant gives consent. And then I thought about that. I have put it in here because consent is really important, but often we don't quite understand what may happen with the data ourselves. And so if we're not clear, then I'm not sure a participant can consent. And so one would have to look to make 100% sure that de-identified non-personal data is used, until we are clear in our minds around the aspects of the governance of personal data. One needs to obviously respect our national, international legislation, as Professor Blaauw suggested. There's intellectual property, who owns the data, and personal data laws, which are absolutely critical. POPIA. One must, if you are going to consider using AI, you have to obviously continue learn about the goods and the bads, and you need to find proper training platforms to be able to learn about the risks and the benefits of using these tools. And one must obviously refrain from using the tools in sensitive activities that may impact other research or organizations, for example, in peer review, evaluation of research protocols, etc. It may have an impact as you've uploaded very sensitive information already into an open access process. You need to promote and guide and support the responsible use in research activities. And so that has to be at all levels for students and in all disciplines. It can't be differential processes for different disciplines. So it must be obviously the researchers, research managers, anybody that is touching data needs to be skilled up in generative AI and the risks and benefits of generative AI and the governance around that. And one must make sure that one provides support and guidelines to ensure compliance with ethical and legal requirements. And so there's a lot of accountability in a field that's a moving target, that's growing, and that we may really not understand. And so the burden, unfortunately, lies with the researcher to cross all the T's and dot all the I's. And if you can't do that, then the tool cannot be used appropriately, because you're going to erode privacy and confidentiality issues and potentially be in trouble. So one must obviously, within the research in organizations, one must help by keeping an active mind. We need a AI environment that is doing the work for us, actively involved in looking to see what new systems are, what the governance looks like, so people can tap into that to help researchers if they're going to use AI in their research. One needs to make guidelines. We've developed a guideline from UCT, from the Senate level. Some thoughts on how to use it. I know UWC have done that as well, and I think Stellies, one needs to look very closely at guidelines in terms of being able to provide insights to researchers in terms of appropriate use, and be careful where it's hosted, because the problem is that if it's hosted or in cloud base, the problem is that the tool may govern itself, and that's very open potentially to misuse and a problem with protection and confidentiality. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Yeah, that was very, very insightful, and just a good reminder that this is still an evolving field. And so we need to be making interval assessments of the risks and benefits if we are going to choose to use AI, and just prioritize the safety and transparency with, for our participants. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you, Prof. I agree. The burden doesn't just lie on the investigator, but also on our ethics teams, and definitely part of our continuous professional development. So thank you for highlighting that. Prof. Blaauw, how should or do ethics committees weigh these risks and benefits in studies, such as early phase trials, where participants may not directly benefit? And how can researchers ethically justify such studies in resource-limited settings while ensuring a fair benefit for participants and communities?
Thanks, Megan. A good question. I'm going to turn it around slightly to say that if you do know upfront that one treatment method is better than the other one, is it then ethical to do the research in the first place? Okay, and that's what we call clinical equipoise. Okay, so you should have a good suspicion that one method might be better than the other one, but if it's been proven already, there's no point, because then you're just wasting resources, etc., etc. So a couple of things is that you have to weigh, and Prof. Blockman have mentioned quite a few of these things, risk and benefit. You have to weigh what will I get from it as a participant, and what do I need to do, and what sort of do you expect of me? And very importantly, that you as the researcher in your ethics application needs to be very clear about the not so good aspects as well, because there always is some form, not necessarily of harm, but some form of discomfort. You expect of me to come in, take a day off from work, spend 5 hours at the hospital, at the clinic, answer endless questionnaires, do many tests and trials. It might not harm me, but it definitely is time expensive, and it is quite a lot of discomfort. So be open and honest about it. Don't just say, oh no, there's no harm attached to that. But then you have to weigh and say, well, what will be the benefit and who will be the beneficiary? And yes, as you've said, many cases, the current participants will not be the direct benefit, as we've just mentioned. That's why we're doing the research. However, if you can prove that in the environment in which you've conducted the research, hopefully in future, that environment will benefit. So what I'm saying by that is, again, is who do we choose to be our study participants? If we conduct a study in the renal unit and we're testing a new method of doing X, Y, and Z in this unit, and hopefully the results of this study, if shown to be beneficial, will change policy, which in future, maybe the same participant on hemodialysis in 3 years to come, or future participants in that same unit will benefit from new legislation, from change in practice or recommendations. But important not to test and do your research on one group if you know for a fact that whatever happens in future, it will not filter down to that group, because then it's not fair. So those are the type of things that the ethics committee will look out for. And maybe just a last thing is, when you conduct any form of intervention study, being it an RCT or any form of intervention, it might be even education as your intervention. then you have to be able to show in the end that your control group, the group that did not receive the intervention, if your intervention proved to be successful in the study group, then your control group should also have access to that. So let's say you've got a video on dietary guidelines that you give to the one group. Then at the end of the study, you should be able to provide your control group also to that information just for future. Then at least you sort of you level out the playing field, and both groups tend to benefit from your research. Thanks.
Thank you for that answer, Prof. And again, actually for adding on further than what we think that our questions were. Thank you. Handing over to Pindile.
Thank you, Prof. And thanks for the reminder to just make sure that our control groups benefit equally as far as is possible from some of these interventions. To Prof. Blockman, we're moving on to our last two questions for our panelists. How can research, in low to middle income countries be made more responsive to local health priorities rather than driven by external funders or pharmaceutical interests?
Thank you again for that question. And again, I've made some slides. You can see I hardly use slides in my teaching, so it's always new for me. So I've looked at the hurdles of clinical studies in low resource settings and maybe just provided some insights and what the way forward is. Just to remind you that our institution and the majority of institutions in South Africa subscribe to the Trust Code, and it's around global collaborations to make sure that everybody benefits, and especially in resource-poor environments, that there's equal share and there's not potential parachuting into a country and just taking all those resources and using it in the first world. It's called the Trust Code. So just to remind us around what has happened in terms of medical progress, there's malpractice, there's certainly uneven global distribution of available medical resources, there's uneven distribution of global burdens of disease, and I'll show you. There's even deadly diseases have risen, epidemics. We had COVID recently. And then there's the negative role of big business and the profit motives. And if you believe that any of the pharmaceutical industry is altruistic, you're completely incorrect. They're purely in the business for making money. And in the HIV era, in the 1999-2000, when we were looking at what's called post-trial care in the management of patients with HIV, where antiretrovirals were not available in our country, but were providing benefit, the industry said, we are not in the business of looking after patients, yet they're willing to enroll participants, get the data, and register medicines overseas for sale. And there's obviously a breakdown in traditional health systems. So just to look at low-income countries, and it's 12% of the population in 2022, in excess of 42% when you add them low-middle-income countries together. And so Salim Youssef suggested that over 80% of the global disease burden occurs in developed countries, yet the proportion of research conducted in these countries is less than 10% of the global research activity. So our developing countries have the burden and very little research occurs. And there's the 1090 gap, which you'll know about. And no matter what yardstick you use, the global disease burden is weighed against the developing countries, and especially sub-Saharan Africa. And that's because of the global north issue of the global north. We have poverty and ill health. There's a glaring massive discrepancy between the availability of health research funding and the diseases responsible for the highest global burden of disease. And that's termed the 1090 gap. And it's worth our colleagues around the table understanding the 1090 gap, which is what I've shown you before. And Africa's formidable disease burden, communicable disorders, malnutrition, childhood diseases, maternal perinatal problems, the epidemics that we've seen. And despite significant improvements in child mortality rates, the rate is still about 20 times higher than in developed countries when you look at the maternal rates and child mortality rates. And despite great reductions in maternal morbidity and mortality, 100 times more African women die from pregnancy-related causes than in the developed world. And these reports are freely accessible. And life expectancy is plummeting as a result of current epidemics, violence, and other health life threats in our environments. So why it's particularly critical, there's high levels of poverty, heavy burden of diseases, TB, malaria, typhoid, meningitis, cryptococcal meningitis, and HIV. There's obviously a paucity of healthcare resources in our environment, and a lot of the federally funded money was taken away, as you've seen. You bear witness to that. High levels of illiteracy and lack of awareness, and we spoke about informed consent issues. And there's massive problems in locomotion and communication in these environments. And obviously political war, political instability, conflicts and civil wars have corrupted healthcare in those environments. And often there's been hopelessness. And so one has to get out of that hopelessness to move this process forward. And so some of the problems of industrialized world medical research is market-orientated, profit-derived, that's shark fin, make as much money as you can as quickly as possible before the patents wear off. There's obviously moral blind economic forces, and there's a high degree of ad hoc rationalization, ethical justifications for doing research in vulnerable populations and not cared about that vulnerable population. You parachute in and parachute out. So what is the benefit of studies within our environment? Access to more effective treatments, chance for cure, prolonging life when other methods have failed. There's a contribution to medical research that may in fact help somebody else in the future. Access to methods of relieving symptoms which may not be available. Access to closer and more frequent follow-ups from the research. And there may be financial benefits because cost of treatment and transport costs are shared by sponsors. And so there may be benefits. So just to show you some of the lack of infrastructure and social infrastructure, that is why you are talking about this. The lack of medical infrastructure in terms of sophistication and laboratory accessibility. Again, lack of medical infrastructure, and just show you that's the nasogastric tube. You try and deal with this in any situation. And obviously, socioeconomic issues which may be a problem within the environment and corrupt healthcare. And then the inadequate number of healthcare workers. If you look at the number of doctors, nurses, and midwives per thousand populations, you can see sub-Saharan Africa over here, which is why we have the burden of disease. And you can see what's different in America and in Europe. What about the vulnerable patient? We spoke about you can't get away people from vulnerability within our environment. And these we've already looked at. Diminished capacity, economically disadvantaged, socially disadvantaged, minority groups, and refugees. I don't want to look at this now. This was just looking at hemodialysis and the complete lack of hemodialysis services and the smitterings in certain places in various countries. And the burden of disease, HIV prevalence, and the combined HIV-TB prevalence. And then as people live longer with HIV, there's a risk of non-communicable disorders as well. And these are the hurdles to clinical studies. And the distrust for the pharmaceutical industry, pressure to increase profits has forced the industry to adopt a shameless profit over people strategy and has deepened distrust in the industry. And that's no different now. And Pfizer accused of testing new drugs without ethics approval. That's happened before, and settles with victims of Nigerian drug trial. And it's happened over here as well with AZT studies in mother-to-child transmission. So is it feasible to conduct clinical trials in low resource poor settings? And remember, the low resource countries are not all the same, do not have the same problems. So one size doesn't fit all, and one has to be cultural specific for that environment. So this is really important, and probably not a bad thing to have in your life anyhow. Things that you can control, things you can influence, and things you can't control or influence. Not a bad take home for all of us who are involved and potentially have high pressurized environments. And so how do we improve in low-resource countries? Well, develop a genuine interest in research, network with established researchers, make yourself available, apply for grants to try and collaborate within environments. Make sure that there's institutional review boards, ethics committees are functional and available in those countries. They must have competent members. They must expedite the process of study review. Otherwise, you have long processes, and that again feeds back into the negativity of doing research. And if there's unscientific, unethical studies, you must be able to say no to big pharma, that this is unethical. And Professor Blaauw said that that clinical equipoise, one must do a study if you're going to break equipoise. If not, and you know what the answer is, then the study is unethical. We need to look at a change from profit over people to people over profit. And industry must invest more in clinical research, journal access and subscriptions. You try and do journal clubs in various environments just to build up the skill. I've shown you some terrible pictures about having no basic equipment. One must have training courses in terms of methodology and especially research methodology, GCP, which is good clinical practice, and provide the funding and fellowships in the environment to stimulate research and to get people interested and excited about doing research. And so there's the 6 pairs of things to celebrate on Initial Clinical Trials Day, and I thought this was good from Dave Sackett. So because we must celebrate, it's important to celebrate of where we are. So in our setting, patients are increasingly being involved in randomized control studies. That the claim that participants are just guinea pigs are being refuted because they inform consent and the studies are more obvious for that country's requirements. We're seeing more randomized control studies in low-income countries. The trial questions and the protocols are being seen before data acquisition and being massaged, so we actually see transparency in the studies. And the idea of sharing results is gaining momentum, so we can actually do something with and change policy. Ethics committees are doing better in terms of reducing harm, and there's better statistics to make sure that the data that we are achieving is of clinical and statistical significance. And then there's the various collaborations that are making sure that the data is data rich and we can use the data. So what I can say is low-income country randomized control studies are increasing in number, local relevance, international recognition, and they're increasingly led by local trialists. And what that means is that if you're getting your name on the stage, on the international stage, and you're publishing, that means that you can access funding. It's very hard to access funding if nobody knows about you. And so part of the knock-on effect is to be first or last author, and so that people get aware of you as a researcher and provide funding. And some of the challenges of developed broad medical research: can commercial motives be combined with altruistic philanthropy? These questions I'm asking. Can such research be non-exploitative? Can it avoid harming the vulnerable? Can it avoid applying double standards? Can it avoid undue inducement? Look at the amount, the rand dollar, the rand pound, the rand euro. Can it apply the imperative of autonomy or respect for persons? And can it separate the ethical imperatives from culture and ideology? It's questions that I leave for you to answer. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Prof. That was really great. I think even just in shaping what the gaps in access to care are in low to middle income countries. And yeah, we're not without opportunities to enter and try and fill in those gaps with evidence-based medicine. And thank you for those questions you posed at the end as well. I think those are some great questions to reflect on.
Thank you, Prof. And yeah, great to also hear the things that we can celebrate and where there are solutions and opportunity for us all. Prof. Blaauw, our last question. In low and middle income countries' research collaborations, how should data ownership be determined? And what best practices ensure fair authorship, recognition, and equitable data sharing?
Thanks, Megan. And in the interest of time, I'm going to be very short because we have touched on quite a few of these things. I think the most important thing is, as I've mentioned before, the intellectual property. The intellectual property remains at your institution. So you have to ensure that you fight for that and that you protect that. And if you're part of an international study, you have to ensure upfront that that is very clearly stipulated in the contract. Nowadays, if you submit an application to the ethics committee, the moment there's more than one collaborator from different institutions, you have to submit a data transfer agreement, which is a clear document that indicates how the data will be shared, who takes responsibility, who should publish, who shouldn't publish, who can publish first, who can use what type of data. So you stipulate that upfront. Or you have a material transfer agreement. If, for instance, you've got blood samples that needs to be sent to Europe for whatever, you need to very clearly indicate how does that process work and who has first dibs on the results. So if you work with your legal institution, you can set up a contract and you can ensure that you retain the data and that you retain first authorship on your data, and that you also have a very clear and a very strict policy that no data can be published out of context, which means that you have the right to approve of anything that is published on this study where you've been part of that study. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof, for that clear and concise answer. And I think it clarifies many of the points that we have alluded to, as you said. So for the interest of time, we are going to limit it to one question, which is actually aimed at Prof. Blaauw. Hi, Prof. You mentioned the layered approach to consent for minors. Are there ever instances where, even with adequate counseling, a child refuses to assent, but the parents consent? And when is there in this conflict, how should one navigate this? Is the child assent binding, or can it be overridden by parental consent? Over to you, Prof. Blaauw.
Legally, it can be overridden by parental consent. That, unfortunately, is the law. But ethically, do you want to do that? So I think the question that you would ask yourself is, does the child really understand? Was I clear enough in my explanation? And what are the concerns of the child, and why do they say no? So what are they worried about and what are they afraid about? And vice versa, if the parents or the legal guardians say yes, you can also ask yourself, why do they say yes? Is it that there's an unfair remuneration attached to the study, and they're looking at from that angle and not from the science angle? So you can actually sort of investigate both angles and try and understand why is there a difference in the responses. It's not a quick answer. It's sort of going back to the drawing board and trying to understand the reason for the yes and for the no, and try and see if you can mitigate that through discussion.
Thank you very much, Prof. That was a fantastic answer.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you so much for clarifying that. And I think it really does highlight the legal versus ethical dilemma that we often encounter. But there is a way to hopefully unite the two ideas. And thank you so much to our profs. We'll just ask if Prof. Blockman and Prof. Blaauw have any final closing remarks before we close up the webinar.
I can maybe just start to say that I've actually prepared one slide, which is a slide that Prof. Blockman has also shown, and that's the slide that indicates the 8 benchmarks of clinical research in low-resourced countries. And I think if we stick to those 8 principles, and it is on his slides, and we can answer each of those 8 components when you submit your ethics application, then we should feel comfortable that we have sort of ticked most of the boxes of importance. And I want to thank you guys for hosting this webinar and for being interested in research, and extend an invitation to you that if you need any support or any just bouncing off of ideas, you are most welcome to contact me. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, so thank you very much. It's been a wonderful session. I absolutely agree. I do want to remind you that in the military approach that we often have in the academic environment, be very careful about senior colleagues suggesting that ethics approval isn't required, or we've got ethics approval in 2015 to do the work, and so everything is absolutely fine, because people will become unstuck. And so part of it is to grow this upwards, and that everything requires ethics review until such time as an ethics committee suggests it doesn't require review and there's a waiver. And if you hold that dear, plus some of the other aspects, then you won't get into trouble with doing unethical research within the environment, because you've held that up at the highest level and thinking about it in your protocol development. Thank you very much. It's a wonderful session, and it was lovely to spend time with Professor Blaauw. Thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you
Thank
to
you
our
very
two
much.
profs. Oh,
So sorry. We're
no
both so
problem.
excited to say thank you.
Yeah. These are our take-home messages. I think both of the profs really did well in covering everything. In the interest of time, I won't go through them, but I think we will be making these slides available and making this recording available as well. And so I'll hand over to Megan to close off our session.
We'd just like to say it's been an honor to host our panelists, and we'd like to thank both of you for your time, insights, knowledge that you've shared with us this evening. We would also like to thank Safe Surgery for assisting us with our Zoom webinar link. You've been a fantastic part of our team. To our guests and attendees for joining our panel discussion and engaging with our panelists, as well as the SAMTRA team for the efforts behind the scenes. Have a good evening, everybody, and thank you again.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thank you. Go
everybody.
well.
Bye.